Sarah Martinez clutched her boarding pass tightly as she walked down the narrow aisle of Flight 447 from Dallas to Boston. The first-class ticket had been an unexpected gift from her late father's estate lawyer, something about frequent flyer miles that had accumulated over decades of business travel. She had never flown first class before, and the leather seats and extra legroom felt almost foreign to her. As a 28-year-old social worker from a modest neighborhood in East Dallas, Sarah was used to economy seats and budget airlines. Her worn denim jacket and simple black t-shirt stood in stark contrast to the business suits and designer clothing worn by other first-class passengers. She could feel their curious glances as she made her way to seat 2A, trying to ignore the whispered conversations that seemed to follow her movement. The flight attendant, a middle-aged woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and a practiced smile, approached Sarah shortly after she had settled into her seat. "Excuse me, miss," the attendant said, her voice carrying a tone of polite authority. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass again." Sarah handed over the crumpled paper, confusion flickering across her face.
The attendant studied it carefully, then glanced at Sarah's appearance with barely concealed skepticism.
"I'm sorry, but there seems to be some confusion. Are you sure this is your seat?" "Yes, it says 2A right here," Sarah replied, pointing to the clearly printed seat assignment. She could feel the eyes of nearby passengers turning toward them, and her cheeks began to burn with embarrassment.
The flight attendant's smile became more strained.
"Well, there might have been an error in the system. Let me check with the gate agent about possibly moving you to your correct seat in economy." Before Sarah could respond, the attendant was already walking away, speaking quietly into her headset. Sarah sat frozen in her seat, acutely aware that she had become the center of unwanted attention. A businessman in the seat across from her shook his head and muttered something about people trying to sneak into first class. Minutes passed like hours as Sarah waited, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the armrests. She thought about her father, Miguel Martinez, who had worked 2 jobs his entire life to support their family. He had cleaned office buildings at night and worked construction during the day, his hands always rough and calloused from honest work. Those same hands had saved every penny to ensure Sarah could attend college and pursue her dream of helping others. The flight attendant returned with a stern expression and a security officer in tow. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to gather your things and come with us. There's been a mistake with your seat assignment." "But this is my ticket," Sarah protested, her voice growing stronger despite her nervousness. "My father's lawyer gave this to me. It's legitimate." The security officer, a tall man with kind eyes but a firm demeanor, stepped forward. "I'm sure we can sort this out, miss. But for now, we need to resolve this situation so the flight can depart on time." Sarah felt tears of humiliation threatening to spill over as she reached for her small backpack. She had worked so hard to get where she was, graduating from the University of Texas with honors, despite working part-time jobs throughout college. She had spent the last 5 years dedicated to helping underprivileged families navigate social services, often working long hours for little pay because she believed in making a difference. As she stood to leave, her jacket shifted slightly, revealing a portion of an intricate tattoo on her left shoulder. It was a beautifully detailed design incorporating wings, a compass, and military insignia, but most passengers only caught a glimpse of dark ink against her skin. She heard someone whisper, "I knew she didn't belong in first class," and her heart sank further. The security officer guided her toward the front of the plane, past the curious stares and judgmental looks of the first-class passengers. Sarah kept her head down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. She thought about calling her supervisor to explain why she might be late for the important conference in Boston, wondering how she would afford a new ticket if they removed her from the flight entirely.
"This is ridiculous," she whispered to herself, but loud enough for the security officer to hear.
"What's ridiculous, miss?" he asked, his tone surprisingly gentle.
"I belong on this flight."
"That ticket is mine, but because I don't look like I can afford first class, they assume I'm lying or trying to scam my way into a better seat." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke. The security officer paused in the galley area, studying her face carefully. "What's your name, miss?" "Sarah Martinez," she replied, wiping away a tear that had escaped despite her efforts to remain composed.
"And you said this ticket came from a lawyer?"
"Yes, my father passed away 3 months ago. His estate had accumulated frequent flyer miles, and the lawyer said I could use them for this trip. I'm going to Boston for a social work conference." She pulled out a folder from her backpack, showing him the official documentation from the law firm and her conference registration. The security officer examined the papers carefully, his expression growing more thoughtful. Meanwhile, The flight attendant stood nearby with her arms crossed, clearly impatient to resolve what she saw as a simple case of seat fraud. "Robert, we really need to get this sorted quickly," she said to the security officer. "The captain is asking about the delay." Just then, the cockpit door opened, and Captain James Hawk Mitchell stepped out to see what was causing the holdup. He was a distinguished man in his early 50s, with silver hair and the confident bearing that came from decades of military and commercial aviation experience. His eyes immediately took in the scene. A young Hispanic woman holding back tears, flanked by security and flight crew. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice calm but authoritative. The flight attendant quickly explained her version of events, emphasizing what she saw as obvious discrepancies between Sarah's appearance and her first-class ticket. Captain Mitchell listened without interruption, his experienced eyes taking in details that others had missed. As Sarah shifted nervously under his gaze, her jacket moved again, revealing more of her shoulder tattoo. This time, Captain Mitchell's eyes widened slightly as he caught sight of the military insignia within the intricate design. His expression changed from professional curiosity to something deeper, more personal. "Miss Martinez," he said quietly, "may I ask about your tattoo?" Sarah looked down at her shoulder, suddenly self-conscious about the artwork that meant so much to her. It's for my father. He was in the Air Force." Captain Mitchell stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "What unit?" "The 352nd Special Operations Group." He was a pararescue specialist, Sarah replied, pride evident in her voice despite her current situation. The captain's face went pale. The 352nd Special Operations Group was an elite unit, and pararescue specialists were among the most highly trained and decorated airmen in the military. These were the men who risked their lives to save others, often behind enemy lines in the most dangerous conditions imaginable. "Your father's name was Miguel Martinez?" Captain Mitchell asked, his voice heavy with emotion. Sarah nodded, confused by the sudden change in the captain's demeanor. "Yes, Staff Sergeant Miguel Martinez. Did you know him?" Captain Mitchell closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, they were filled with tears. "Miss Martinez, your father saved my life in Afghanistan 15 years ago." The galley fell silent. Even the impatient flight attendant stopped fidgeting as the weight of the captain's words settled over everyone present. Sarah stared at him in shock, unable to process what she was hearing.
There was an explosion. Captain Mitchell continued, his voice thick with memory.
"Our helicopter went down in hostile territory. I was trapped in the wreckage with a broken leg and internal injuries. Your father rappelled down from a rescue helicopter under heavy enemy fire to pull me out. He carried me to safety and stayed with me until the medical team could stabilize me." Sarah felt the world spinning around her. Her father had rarely spoken about his military service, and never in detail about specific missions or the people he had helped. She knew he had been decorated for valor, but he had always deflected her questions with a simple, "I was just doing my job, mija." "He never told me about specific rescues," she whispered. "He said it wasn't important to talk about the past."
That sounds like Miguel. Captain Mitchell smiled through his tears.
"He was the most humble hero I ever met. After I recovered, I tried to stay in touch, but you know how it is with military life. People get transferred, contact gets lost. I never got the chance to properly thank him." The security officer and flight attendant exchanged glances, both realizing that this was no ordinary case of mistaken seat assignment. The other first-class passengers who had been eavesdropping on the conversation began to understand that they had witnessed something profound. "Miss Martinez," Captain Mitchell said formally, "on behalf of American Airlines, and more importantly, on behalf of a grateful man whose life was saved by your father's courage, I want to personally apologize for this misunderstanding. You belong exactly where you were sitting." Sarah felt overwhelmed by emotion, tears flowing freely now as she thought about her father and the impact he had made on people's lives. She remembered his calloused hands, the way he would come home exhausted from his civilian jobs but still make time to help her with homework, or listen to her dreams of making a difference in the world. "He would have been so proud of who you've become," Captain Mitchell added gently, "a social worker helping families in need. You're carrying on his legacy of service in your own way." The flight attendant, now thoroughly embarrassed by her earlier behavior, stepped forward awkwardly. "Miss Martinez, I sincerely apologize for the confusion. Please let me escort you back to your seat and ensure you have everything you need for a comfortable flight."
As they walked back through first class, the atmosphere had completely changed. The businessman who had earlier muttered about seat fraud now looked ashamed, avoiding eye contact.
Other passengers who had been judgmental now seemed to understand that appearances could be deeply deceiving. Captain Mitchell accompanied them back to seat 2A, wanting to ensure that Sarah was properly settled. Miss Martinez, would it be possible for me to speak with you more about your father during the flight? I have so many things I wanted to tell him, and I think you should hear them. Sarah nodded, still overwhelmed but grateful for this unexpected connection to her father's hidden past. As she settled back into her seat, she gently touched the tattoo on her shoulder, feeling closer to her father than she had since his death. The businessman across the aisle leaned over slightly. Miss, I owe you an apology. I made assumptions I had no right to make. Your father sounds like an incredible man.
He was, Sarah replied softly, her voice steadying as she found her composure.
He taught me that everyone deserves respect and dignity, regardless of how they look or where they come from. As the flight attendants completed their final safety checks, Captain Mitchell returned to the cockpit with a renewed sense of purpose. He had spent 15 years wondering what had happened to the man who saved his life, and now he had the chance to honor that man's memory by ensuring his daughter was treated with the respect she deserved. The flight began its taxi toward the runway, but the real journey for Sarah Martinez was just beginning. She was about to learn things about her father that would change how she saw her own life and purpose, revelations that would come from the most unlikely of sources at 30,000 feet above the ground. Once the plane reached cruising altitude and the seatbelt sign was turned off, Captain Mitchell made an unprecedented decision. He turned control of the aircraft over to his co-pilot, First Officer Janet Stevens, and made his way back to the first-class cabin. This was highly unusual, but Janet understood the significance of what had transpired during boarding. She had heard the entire conversation over the intercom and knew this was a moment that transcended normal protocol. Sarah was gazing out the window at the clouds below, still processing everything that had happened. The tattoo on her shoulder seemed to carry new weight now, knowing that it represented not just her father's service, but a specific act of heroism that had saved the life of the man now piloting their aircraft. Miss Martinez, Captain Mitchell said softly as he approached her seat, would you mind if I sat down for a few minutes? I'd like to tell you about the day your father changed my life forever. Sarah nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. The flight attendant who had earlier questioned her legitimacy now hovered nearby, eager to provide any assistance, and clearly still embarrassed by her earlier behavior. Can I get you both anything to drink? She asked, her tone now respectful and genuinely concerned. Just water for me, Sarah replied, while Captain Mitchell declined with a polite thank you. As he settled into the seat, Captain Mitchell took a deep breath, clearly preparing to revisit memories that were both painful and precious. It was October 15, 2009. I was a younger man then, flying combat missions in Afghanistan as part of Operation Enduring Freedom. Your father was part of a specialized team that provided search and rescue support for downed aircraft and personnel in hostile territory. Sarah listened intently, hungry for details about a part of her father's life that had always been shrouded in mystery. Miguel had always been reluctant to discuss his military service, changing the subject whenever she asked about his medals or the faded photographs she sometimes glimpsed in his dresser drawer. We were conducting a routine supply mission to Forward Operating Base Chapman when everything went wrong. Captain Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone recounting a military operation. Intelligence had indicated light enemy presence in the area, but as we learned that day, intelligence is often incomplete. The captain paused, his eyes distant as he relived that traumatic day. We were about 10 minutes out from the landing zone when the helicopter began taking heavy ground fire.
At first, it seemed manageable. We'd all been through worse.
But then, a rocket-propelled grenade caught us in the tail rotor. Sarah felt her heart racing as she imagined her father in such a dangerous situation. She had always known he was brave, but hearing the specific details of his heroism made it feel real in a way it never had before.
The helicopter went down hard, Captain Mitchell continued.
We crashed in a valley about 15 miles from the nearest friendly forces, right in the middle of territory controlled by hostile insurgents. 3 of my crew members died on impact. I was trapped in the wreckage with both legs crushed, and what I later learned was severe internal bleeding. The businessman across the aisle had stopped pretending to read his magazine and was openly listening to the conversation, his face reflecting the gravity of the story being told. The pain was incredible, but worse than that was the knowledge that enemy forces were closing in on our position. I could hear gunfire getting closer, and I knew that if I didn't get help soon, I wouldn't survive. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, the rotors of an incoming rescue helicopter. Captain Mitchell's voice began to strengthen as he moved toward the part of the story that had defined his perspective on courage and sacrifice for the past 15 years. The rescue bird couldn't land because of the terrain and ongoing enemy fire, so they had to hover about 60 feet above the crash site.
That's when I first saw your father.
He rappelled down on a rope wearing full combat gear and carrying medical supplies while bullets were literally flying around him. Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes as she pictured her quiet, humble father performing such an act of extraordinary bravery. The man who had always insisted on driving carefully and wearing seatbelts, who worried when she stayed out too late in college, had voluntarily descended into a war zone to save strangers. Miguel landed right next to the wreckage and immediately began assessing the situation. He could have made a quick assessment, decided I was too badly injured to save, and extracted himself to safety. Instead, he spent precious minutes carefully examining my injuries and determining the best way to get me out without causing additional damage.
The flight attendant returned with Sarah's water, setting it down quietly before retreating to give them privacy.
Other passengers in first class had grown silent, drawn into the compelling narrative of heroism and sacrifice. The whole time he was working to free me from the wreckage, your father kept talking to me, keeping me conscious and focused. He told me about his daughter who was studying in college, how proud he was of her grades and her determination to help other people. He said she was going to change the world by helping families who needed someone to believe in them. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Even in that life-or-death situation, her father had been thinking about her and sharing his pride with a stranger he was risking his life to save. It took him almost 20 minutes to extract me from the helicopter, and enemy forces were getting closer the entire time. The rescue helicopter crew was reporting increasing small arms fire and urgent recommendations to abort the mission. But Miguel refused to leave without me. Captain Mitchell reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph. It showed two men in military uniforms standing next to a helicopter, both smiling despite obvious exhaustion and stress. One was a younger version of Captain Mitchell, his arm in a sling. The other was unmistakably Sarah's father, though she had never seen him in his military uniform. That was taken at the field hospital after the rescue, Captain Mitchell explained. Miguel stayed with me through the entire medical evacuation and initial treatment. He didn't have to do that. His mission was complete once he got me to the rescue helicopter. But he wanted to make sure I was going to be okay. Sarah stared at the photograph, seeing her father in a completely new light. The man in the picture looked confident and capable, in a way that was different from the gentle, hard-working father she had known. This was Miguel Martinez, the warrior, the trained professional who saved lives in impossible circumstances. After I recovered and was transferred to a stateside hospital, I tried to stay in touch with Miguel. We exchanged a few letters and I learned more about his civilian life, his work ethic, and especially his devotion to you.
He would write pages about your academic achievements, your volunteer work, your dream of becoming a social worker.
The captain's voice became softer, more personal. In one letter, he told me that saving people was a family tradition. He said his job was to save soldiers in combat, but your job would be to save families in peacetime. He was incredibly proud of the person you were becoming. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the revelation that her father had shared details of her life with someone she had never met, someone whose life he had saved in a place she couldn't even properly imagine.
What happened to the correspondence? She asked.
Why did you lose touch? Captain Mitchell's expression grew sad. Military life is complicated. I was reassigned to different bases. Miguel completed his tour and returned to civilian life, and gradually our communication faded. I always meant to track him down again, but years passed and life got in the way. I regret that deeply. He looked directly into Sarah's eyes, his voice becoming urgent with emotion. I want you to understand something important. Your father didn't just save my physical life that day. He changed how I thought about courage, sacrifice, and what it means to serve others. Every day for the past 15 years, I've tried to live up to the example he set. The captain gestured around the aircraft cabin. This job, flying commercial airlines, might seem ordinary compared to combat missions, but your father taught me that every form of service matters.
I did do this to myself.
Every time I safely transport passengers to their destinations, I'm honoring the lesson he taught me about taking care of other people. Sarah realized that the ripple effects of her father's heroism had extended far beyond that single rescue mission. Captain Mitchell had been inspired to dedicate his civilian career to service, safely transporting thousands of passengers over the years. In a sense, her father's act of courage had continued to save lives long after he had returned home from the war. There's something else I want you to know, Captain Mitchell continued. After Miguel saved me, I made a promise to myself. I promised that if I ever had the opportunity to help his daughter, I would do everything in my power to honor the debt I owed him.
He looked around the first-class cabin, his expression growing determined.
What happened during boarding today was unacceptable. You were judged and mistreated based on assumptions about your appearance and background. That's exactly the kind of prejudice your father fought against, both in the military and in his civilian life. The captain stood up, his voice taking on the authority of someone accustomed to command. Miss Martinez, I want to make sure the rest of your journey reflects the respect and dignity you deserve as Miguel Martinez's daughter. More importantly, I want to make sure you understand the incredible legacy you carry.
He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. This is something I've carried with me for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to honor your father's memory. Sarah opened the box to find a beautiful military medal, gleaming gold with intricate engravings, and a ribbon of blue and white.
This is a Civilian Medal of Honor, Captain Mitchell explained. It's awarded to civilians who demonstrate exceptional courage in support of military operations. I've been trying for years to get your father posthumously recognized for his heroism. Sarah stared at the medal, understanding that this represented formal acknowledgement of her father's extraordinary bravery. I've been working with veterans organizations and military historians to document Miguel's service record, Captain Mitchell continued. There are other people whose lives he saved, other missions where he went above and beyond. Your father was a genuine American hero, and it's time the world knew it. The impact of this revelation was almost too much for Sarah to process. She had spent her entire life knowing her father was a good man who worked hard and loved his family. Now she was learning that he was also a decorated war hero whose actions had saved multiple lives and inspired others to lives of service. Why didn't he ever tell me about any of this? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Captain Mitchell smiled gently. Because that's who Miguel Martinez was. He didn't see himself as a hero. He saw himself as someone who had a job to do. The most extraordinary people often think their actions are ordinary. Your father was more concerned with raising you to be a good person than with impressing you with stories of his own courage. As the plane continued toward Boston, Sarah felt as though she was discovering her father all over again. What is it sick? The quiet man who had worked 2 jobs to support his family, who had insisted on helping her with college applications and celebrated every academic achievement, had also been a warrior who risked his life to save others in the most dangerous circumstances imaginable. Captain Mitchell, she said finally, thank you for telling me all this. I feel like I understand my father in a completely new way. There's more to tell, he replied, settling back into his seat. If you're willing to listen, I'd like to share some of the other stories I've learned about your father's service, and I'd love to hear about the man he was as a civilian and a father.
As the plane flew eastward toward Boston, 2 strangers connected by an act of heroism 15 years earlier began to share stories that would bridge the gap between Miguel Martinez the soldier and Miguel Martinez the father, creating a complete picture of an extraordinary man whose legacy lived on in ways he never could have imagined. As the plane continued its steady flight toward Boston, Captain Mitchell and Sarah settled into a conversation that would transform her understanding of her father's life forever. Other first-class passengers had grown quiet, sensing the profound nature of what was unfolding in Seat 2A, while the flight crew maintained respectful distance while ensuring both passengers had everything they needed. Before we talk about your father's other missions, Captain Mitchell said carefully, I want you to know that I've spent considerable time over the years researching Miguel's complete service record. What I learned amazed me, but it also helped me understand why he was so reluctant to discuss his military service with his family. Sarah leaned forward, eager to understand more about the man who had shaped her values and worldview without ever revealing the extraordinary courage that defined his professional life. Your father served 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan between 2007 and 2010, Captain Mitchell began. He was a member of the Elite Pararescue Corps, which meant he was trained not just in combat operations but in advanced medical procedures, search and rescue techniques, and survival training that few people in any military can match.
The captain pulled out a folder from his briefcase, one that appeared well-worn from frequent handling. After our encounter, I became somewhat obsessed with understanding who Miguel Martinez really was. I contacted other veterans who had served with him, researched mission reports that had been declassified, and interviewed people whose lives he had touched during his service. Sarah felt a mixture of excitement and apprehension as she realized she was about to learn details about her father's life that had been hidden from her for nearly 3 decades. Miguel's call sign was Angel. Captain Mitchell continued with a slight smile. His fellow pararescuers gave him that name because of his ability to appear in impossible situations and somehow extract people who seemed beyond saving. By the time he completed his service, he was credited with saving the lives of 47 military personnel and an unknown number of Afghan civilians. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. 47 people were alive today because of her father's courage and skill. 47 families had been spared the grief that she had experienced when Miguel died. The magnitude of his service was almost incomprehensible.
One mission in particular stands out. Captain Mitchell said, his voice dropping to a more serious tone. In March 2009, about 7 months before he saved my life, Miguel was involved in a rescue operation that became legendary among Special Operations Forces.
He opened his folder and pulled out a photograph that showed a devastated mountainous landscape with the wreckage of what appeared to be a military transport helicopter scattered across rocky terrain. A supply helicopter carrying medical supplies and personnel to a remote outpost was shot down during a fierce snowstorm.
The crash site was in territory controlled by enemy forces, surrounded by hostile fighters, and the weather made traditional rescue operations impossible. 8 people were on board, including 2 Army medics and a Red Cross nurse who were desperately needed at a forward operating base where soldiers were dying from their injuries.
Sarah studied the photograph, trying to imagine the conditions her father had faced in that desolate, dangerous environment. Command initially decided the rescue was too risky. Captain Mitchell continued.
The weather was getting worse. Enemy activity in the area was increasing, and reconnaissance suggested that anyone who survived the crash would likely be captured or killed before help could arrive. The mission was officially classified as a body recovery operation. The captain paused, allowing the gravity of that decision to sink in. Miguel disagreed with that assessment. He volunteered for what was essentially a suicide mission, requesting permission to attempt a rescue during a brief break in the storm. His commanding officer tried to talk him out of it, but Miguel insisted that his oath as a pararescue man meant he could never abandon people who might still be alive. Sarah felt her heart racing as she anticipated the rest of the story. She could picture her father, the same man who had taught her to ride a bicycle and helped her with algebra homework, making the decision to risk his life for strangers in impossible conditions. Miguel parachuted alone into the crash site during a brief window when the storm lessened enough to make the insertion possible. What he found there was worse than anyone had imagined. The helicopter had broken apart on impact, with survivors scattered across a wide area. 3 people had died in the crash, but 5 were still alive, including the Red Cross nurse who was severely injured but trying to treat the other survivors with limited supplies.
Captain Mitchell's voice became more animated as he described the technical aspects of what Miguel had accomplished.
Working alone, in sub-zero temperatures, with enemy forces less than 2 miles away, your father spent 6 hours stabilizing the injured survivors and preparing them for extraction. He had to perform field surgery on the nurse, who had internal bleeding, while simultaneously treating hypothermia and traumatic injuries in the other survivors. The businessman across the aisle had given up any pretense of privacy and was openly listening to the story, his expression reflecting amazement at the level of skill and courage being described. The extraction itself was a masterpiece of precision and bravery. Captain Mitchell continued.
Miguel had to signal for help using emergency equipment that was partially damaged in the crash, guide rescue helicopters to the site despite poor visibility, and coordinate the evacuation of 5 critically injured people while under sporadic enemy fire.
Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she imagined her father performing these incredible feats of heroism while she was probably sitting in a college classroom, completely unaware that her dad was literally saving lives on the other side of the world. All 5 survivors were successfully evacuated, Captain Mitchell concluded. The Red Cross nurse, Maria Santos, not only survived but was able to return to service and save countless lives at the forward operating base. 2 of the Army medics Miguel rescued went on to complete their tours and become civilian doctors. The other 2 survivors recovered fully and were able to return to their families. The captain reached into his folder again and pulled out a letter written on Red Cross letterhead. This is from Maria Santos. She wrote it last year when she learned I was trying to document your father's complete service record. She's now the head of emergency medical services for the International Red Cross in South America.
Sarah took the letter with trembling hands and began to read Maria's words describing Miguel's heroism and the impact his actions had on her life and career.
The letter detailed how Miguel's calm professionalism under extreme pressure had inspired her to dedicate her life to emergency medicine in conflict zones.
She's not the only one, Captain Mitchell said softly.
I've been in contact with many of the people your father saved during his service.
They've gone on to become doctors, teachers, military leaders, and community activists. The ripple effect of Miguel's courage has touched thousands of lives. Sarah looked up from the letter, overwhelmed by the realization that her father's legacy was far more extensive than she had ever imagined.
Captain Mitchell, why are you telling me all this?
I mean, I'm grateful to learn about my father's service, but what made you decide to research his life so thoroughly?
The captain's expression grew deeply serious. Because I owe Miguel Martinez more than just my physical life.
After he saved me, I went through a period of intense soul-searching about what it means to serve others and live a life of purpose. Your father's example changed my fundamental understanding of courage and sacrifice. He gestured toward the cockpit. When I returned to civilian life, I could have chosen any career path. I had the GI Bill, good connections, and plenty of opportunities in the business world. But I kept thinking about Miguel's dedication to service, his willingness to risk everything for strangers, and his quiet humility about extraordinary achievements. Captain Mitchell's voice became more personal. I chose commercial aviation because I wanted to continue serving people, making sure they arrived safely at their destinations. It's not as dramatic as combat rescue operations, but it's my way of honoring the example your father set. Every flight I complete successfully is a small tribute to his memory.
Sarah began to understand that this chance encounter was about much more than mistaken seat assignments or military heroics. It was about the ongoing impact of her father's values and the way his approach to life had influenced others to pursue their own paths of service.
There's something else you should know, Captain Mitchell continued. Your father talked about you constantly during the time we corresponded. He was incredibly proud of your academic achievements, but what really excited him was your decision to become a social worker. He told me that you understood that real heroism happens in everyday life, helping families navigate difficult circumstances and giving people hope when they have nowhere else to turn. The captain pulled out one more item from his folder, a handwritten letter that Sarah immediately recognized as her father's careful penmanship. Miguel wrote this letter to me shortly before our correspondence ended. He asked me to deliver it to you if anything ever happened to him. I've been carrying it for 8 years, hoping someday I'd have the opportunity to fulfill that promise. Sarah took the letter with shaking hands, seeing her name written in her father's familiar handwriting. As she opened the envelope, she felt as though she was receiving a message from beyond the grave, a final communication from the man who had shaped her understanding of right and wrong. The letter was dated just 2 months before Miguel's death from a heart attack at the construction site where he worked. In it, he expressed his pride in her choice of career and his confidence that she would make a positive difference in the world. But more importantly, he shared his philosophy about service and sacrifice in words that revealed the depth of his character. Mija, the letter began, by the time you read this, you will probably know more about my military service than I ever told you directly. I hope you understand that I kept those stories private not because I was ashamed of them, but because I wanted you to judge me based on who I was as your father, not what I did as a soldier. Sarah continued reading, discovering that her father had been deeply thoughtful about the lessons he wanted to pass on to her. He wrote about the importance of treating all people with dignity, regardless of their circumstances or appearance. He emphasized that true courage was not about dramatic gestures in extraordinary situations, but about consistently choosing to do the right thing, even when it was difficult or unrewarded. The real heroes, Miguel had written, are people like you who dedicate their lives to helping families stay together, helping children find safe homes, and helping people navigate systems that can be confusing and intimidating. Your work requires a different kind of courage, but it's just as important as anything I did in the military. As Sarah finished reading her father's letter, she felt a profound sense of connection to the man she thought she had known so well. The quiet construction worker who had raised her with love and wisdom was also a decorated war hero whose influence extended far beyond his own family. More importantly, she realized that the values he had instilled in her were the same ones that had driven him to risk his life for others in combat. Captain Mitchell, she said finally, thank you for carrying this letter all these years, and thank you for showing me who my father really was. I feel like I understand my own purpose so much more clearly now. The captain smiled warmly. Miguel would be incredibly proud of the woman you've become, Sarah. You're carrying on his legacy in the most important way possible, by living a life dedicated to serving others.
As the plane began its descent toward Boston, Sarah reflected on the extraordinary turn her simple flight had taken. What had begun as an embarrassing case of mistaken identity had become a profound journey of discovery about her father's hidden heroism and the ongoing impact of his values on people he had saved decades earlier.
As Flight 447 began its final approach to Boston Logan International Airport, Sarah Martinez found herself transformed by the revelations of the past 3 hours. What had started as a humiliating experience of being questioned and nearly removed from first class had evolved into a profound exploration of her father's hidden legacy and her own purpose in life. Captain Mitchell had returned to the cockpit to oversee the landing procedures, but not before making arrangements that would extend their connection beyond this single flight. He had given Sarah contact information for the Veterans Organization working to ensure Miguel Martinez received full posthumous recognition for his service, and he had invited her to attend a ceremony in Washington, D.C., where her father would be honored alongside other unsung heroes of the Afghanistan conflict.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Captain Mitchell's voice came over the intercom as the plane descended through the clouds toward Boston. We're beginning our final approach and should be on the ground in about 10 minutes.
The weather in Boston is clear and mild, perfect for whatever brings you to this great city. Sarah looked out the window at the city sprawling below, but her mind was thousands of miles away, imagining her father parachuting into hostile territory to save strangers who were counting on his courage and skill. The tattoo on her shoulder felt different now, heavier with meaning and responsibility. It was no longer just a tribute to a beloved father who had worked hard to provide for his family. What is it, the truth of the sister's suffering?
It was a symbol of a legacy of heroism that she was called to continue in her own way. The flight attendant who had initially questioned Sarah's right to be in first class approached her seat one final time as the plane taxied toward the gate. Her earlier skepticism and barely concealed hostility had been replaced by genuine respect and obvious embarrassment about her initial assumptions. "Miss Martinez," she said quietly, "I want to apologize again for how I treated you during boarding. I made judgments based on your appearance that were completely inappropriate and unprofessional. After hearing about your father's service, I'm ashamed of my behavior."
Sarah looked up at the woman, seeing not an enemy but another human being who had made a mistake and was genuinely trying to make amends. This was exactly the kind of moment her father had prepared her for through his teachings about forgiveness and understanding.
"Thank you for the apology," Sarah replied graciously. "I understand that you were just trying to do your job."
But I hope this experience might help you remember that every passenger has a story, and we can't always tell from looking at someone what they've been through or what they've accomplished. The flight attendant nodded earnestly. You're absolutely right. I've learned an important lesson today, and I promise I'll be more thoughtful in the future. As the plane came to a complete stop at the gate, Captain Mitchell's voice returned to the intercom for a final announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Boston. For those of you continuing on to other destinations, thank you for flying with us.
For those of you who are home, welcome back. And for everyone on board, remember that each of us has the opportunity to serve others in our own way, whether in dramatic circumstances or in the simple kindness we show to strangers.
Sarah smiled, recognizing that this unusually personal announcement was Captain Mitchell's way of sharing the lesson he had learned from Miguel Martinez with all the passengers who had witnessed their extraordinary encounter.
As passengers began gathering their belongings and preparing to disembark, Sarah noticed that the atmosphere in first class had changed completely from the beginning of the flight.
The businessman who had initially been dismissive now approached her with genuine warmth.
"Miss Martinez, I couldn't help but overhear your conversation with the captain."
I want you to know that your father's story has really affected me. I work in corporate finance, and I sometimes lose sight of what real service looks like. Thank you for reminding me that there are people like your father who risk everything for others.
An elderly woman from across the aisle also stopped by Sarah's seat.
Dear, I lost my husband in Vietnam 40 years ago. He was a helicopter pilot, and he always spoke with tremendous respect about the pararescue specialists who saved so many lives during that war.
Your father was part of a very special brotherhood, and you should be incredibly proud.
As Sarah gathered her backpack and prepared to leave the aircraft, she reflected on how completely her perspective had changed during this flight.
She had boarded feeling somewhat out of place, questioning whether she belonged in first class, or even whether her work as a social worker was making a meaningful difference. Now she understood that her father's heroism lived on through her daily efforts to help families in crisis, support children in difficult circumstances, and advocate for people who needed someone to believe in them. Captain Mitchell was waiting for her in the jetway as she exited the plane, having completed his post-flight duties with unusual speed.
Sarah, I meant what I said about staying in touch.
There are people I want you to meet, stories I want you to hear, and ways I think we can honor your father's memory together.
He handed her a business card with his personal contact information and the details for the veterans organization that was working to secure official recognition for Miguel's service.
The ceremony in Washington is in 6 weeks. I would be honored if you would allow me to escort you as my guest. There will be other families there whose loved ones served with distinction, and I think you'll find it meaningful to connect with people who understand what it means to be the child of a quiet hero. Sarah accepted the card, feeling a sense of purpose and connection she hadn't experienced since her father's death 3 months earlier. Captain Mitchell James, I can't thank you enough for what you've shared with me today. You've given me back my father in a way I never expected.
You gave him back to me too, the captain replied with emotion. For 15 years I've carried the memory of the man who saved my life, but I never knew what happened to Miguel after the war.
Learning about his civilian life, his dedication to his family, and the values he passed on to you has completed the picture of who he was as a human being. As they walked through the terminal together, Sarah noticed how differently people reacted to her now. She carried herself with new confidence, understanding that she was the daughter of an American hero and the heir to a legacy of service that extended far beyond her own individual efforts. The security officer who had initially been called to remove her from first class happened to be working the gate area and approached them with a smile.
Miss Martinez, I'm glad to see everything worked out well. Captain Mitchell told me a little about your father's service during our post-flight briefing.
It's an honor to meet the daughter of such a brave man. Sarah thanked him graciously, but her mind was already moving toward the conference she was attending and how her new understanding of her father's legacy would influence her approach to her work.
That by the end of the day,
She was scheduled to present a paper on supporting families affected by military service, and now she had a deeply personal perspective to add to her professional expertise.
James, she said as they reached the baggage claim area, my presentation at this conference is about helping military families transition to civilian life.
Would you be willing to share your perspective on how Miguel's rescue affected your own transition and career choices?
I think it would add a powerful dimension to my research.
Captain Mitchell's face lit up with enthusiasm. I would be honored to contribute to your work. Miguel's example influenced every major decision I made after returning to civilian life. If sharing that story can help other families understand the ongoing impact of military service, it would be another way to honor his memory. As Sarah waited for her luggage, she pulled out her phone and called her supervisor at the social services agency where she worked. Helen, it's Sarah.
I know I'm supposed to be focused on the conference, but something incredible has happened that's going to change how I approach our military family support program.
She spent the next few minutes explaining the basic outline of her encounter with Captain Mitchell, the revelations about her father's service, and the new insights she had gained about the ripple effects of heroism and sacrifice on families and communities. Sarah, this is remarkable, her supervisor responded. When you get back to Dallas, I want you to develop a presentation for our entire staff about what you've learned. And I think we should explore expanding our military family services based on these new perspectives you're developing. As Sarah collected her luggage and prepared to head to her hotel, she reflected on the chain of events that had led to this moment. A simple first-class ticket, inherited from her father's accumulated frequent flyer miles, had connected her with someone whose life had been saved by Miguel's courage 15 years earlier. The humiliation of being questioned and nearly removed from her seat had ultimately led to a profound understanding of her father's hidden legacy and her own calling to continue his tradition of service.
Captain Mitchell walked with her to the taxi stand outside the terminal, their conversation continuing even as their flight together came to an end.
Sarah, I want you to know that meeting you today has been one of the most meaningful experiences of my career. Your father saved my life, but you've reminded me why that life was worth saving. What do you mean? Sarah asked, curious about this reflection.
Miguel didn't just pull me out of a crashed helicopter, Captain Mitchell explained.
He saved me so I could go on to have a family, a career, and opportunities to serve others in my own way. Every passenger I've safely transported, every young pilot I've mentored, every moment of joy with my wife and children, all of that exists because of your father's courage. He paused, looking directly into Sarah's eyes. But until today, I sometimes wondered if I had lived up to the gift he gave me. Meeting you, seeing how he raised you to carry on his values, knowing that his legacy continues through your work, that validates every choice I've made since he saved my life. As Sarah's taxi pulled up to the curb, she gave Captain Mitchell a warm hug, feeling as though she had gained not just new knowledge about her father, but a genuine friend who would help her honor Miguel's memory in meaningful ways. James, thank you for carrying my father's story all these years. And thank you for sharing it with me today. I feel like I finally understand who I am and why my work matters. As her taxi pulled away from the airport, Sarah looked back to see Captain Mitchell waving goodbye, both of them understanding that this chance encounter would continue to influence their lives long after Flight 447 had reached its destination. The conference in Boston would go well, Sarah knew, but more importantly, she now had a deeper understanding of her purpose and a clearer vision of how to honor her father's legacy through her own dedication to helping others. The tattoo on her shoulder was no longer just a memorial to a beloved father. It was a reminder of the ongoing responsibility to serve others with the same courage, humility, and dedication that Miguel Martinez had demonstrated throughout his remarkable life.
As the taxi headed toward downtown Boston, Sarah began planning how she would share her father's story with the families she worked with, knowing that Miguel's example of quiet heroism could inspire others to find their own ways of making a difference in the world. The man who had saved 47 lives in combat had also saved his daughter's understanding of her own purpose, creating a legacy that would continue to grow with each family she helped and each life she touched through her work.
The flight was over, but Sarah Martinez's real journey of understanding her father's legacy and her own calling was just beginning.